They called me a burden and left me with nothing but a note at 17. But what they didn't know was that I was already building something they could never imagine. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of our small apartment as I stood there holding that crumpled piece of paper, the words still burning in my mind like they were written in fire. "You'll figure it out," it said in my mother's hurried handwriting, as if 17 years of raising me could be dismissed with for casual words and a door that would never open for me again. The silence in that empty apartment wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of abandonment settling into every corner of my world. I remember running my fingers along the kitchen counter where we used to eat breakfast together, back when they still pretended to care about my dreams and aspirations. The refrigerator hummed its lonely song, half empty like everything else they left behind, including me. But in that moment of solitude, something inside me shifted, something that had been building in the shadows while they were busy writing me off as their greatest disappointment. They saw failure where I was cultivating determination, weakness where I was developing strength they couldn't recognize. I folded that note carefully and placed it in my wallet, not as a reminder of their abandonment, but as fuel for the fire that was already burning inside me. The apartment felt different now, not empty but full of possibility, like a blank canvas waiting for me to paint my own masterpiece. I walked to the window and looked out at the city sprawling before me, knowing that somewhere in those endless streets was the future I would build with my own hands. Before I tell you how this story ends, I need to know you're here with me. Drop listening in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing how far this story reaches and that someone out there understands what it feels like to be counted out before you even get started. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly I fit into their narrative of disappointment and failure. I was the kid who asked too many questions, dreamed too big, and never seemed satisfied with the small life they had mapped out for me. My older brother Marcus was their golden child, the one who followed every rule, checked every box, and never colored outside the lines they had drawn for him. He graduated valedictorian, got into their dream college, and landed the corporate job that made them beam with pride at every family gathering. My sister Emma was their creative darling, the artist who painted beautiful pictures that decorated their walls and filled their hearts with the kind of joy they never seemed to find in anything I created. She had galleries interested in her work by the time she turned 16, and they would spend hours talking about her artistic vision while I sat quietly at the dinner table, invisible as always. Then there was me, the one who couldn't sit still in school, who questioned authority, who spent more time in the principal's office than the honor roll students they wished I could be like. They saw my restless energy as defiance, my curiosity as troublemaking, and my refusal to follow their predetermined path as evidence that I would never amount to anything worthwhile. Family dinners became interrogation sessions where they would list my failures and shortcomings like reading from a grocery list of disappointments. "Your grades are slipping again," they would say, shaking their heads as if my minus in chemistry was a personal insult to their parenting. "Why can't why? Oh, you be more like your brother and sister," they would ask, as if I hadn't spent years trying to fit into molds that were never designed for someone like me. I learned to eat quickly and excuse myself early, retreating to my room where I could work on projects they never bothered to ask about or understand. The fights started getting worse when I turned 16 and began talking about my plans for the future. I wanted to start my own business, to create something from nothing, to build an empire that would change the world in ways they couldn't even imagine. They laughed at first, thinking it was just another phase I would grow out of like my brief obsession with skateboarding or playing guitar. But when they realized I was serious, when they saw me researching business models and staying up late working on prototypes and business plans, their laughter turned to frustration and then to outright hostility. "You're living in a fantasy," my father would say, his voice sharp with disapproval as he watched me sketching designs at the kitchen table. "You need to focus on real things, real education, real jobs that real people have, not these ridiculous pipe dreams that will leave you broke and homeless." My mother would nod along, adding her own commentary about how I needed to be more practical, more realistic, more like everyone else who had given up on their dreams in favor of security and predictability. They couldn't understand that their version of security felt like a prison to me, that their idea of success looked like failure through my eyes. I tried to explain my vision, to show them the business plan I had been developing, the market research I had conducted, the prototype I had been refining in secret. But they dismissed everything I showed them as childish fantasies, naive dreams that proved how disconnected I was from reality. The more passionate I became about my ideas, the more concerned they grew about my mental state and my future prospects. The breaking point came during spring break of my junior year when I was supposed to be visiting colleges with them. They had selected 5 universities that fit their criteria for what my life should look like, complete with predetermined majors that would lead to predetermined careers that would produce predetermined levels of income and social status. I sat in the car as we drove to the first campus, listening to them plan my entire future without any input from me, and something inside me finally snapped. When we arrived at the university, I told them I needed to use the bathroom and instead walked out of the building, through the parking lot, and down the street toward the bus station. I used the money I had been saving from my part-time job to buy a ticket home, leaving them to tour colleges for a future I had no intention of living. They found me 3 hours later sitting in my room, working on my laptop with business documents spread across my desk like evidence of my rebellion. The argument that followed was unlike anything we had ever experienced before, with voices raised, doors slammed, and words spoken that could never be taken back. They accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, and delusional, while I accused them of trying to kill my dreams before they ever had a chance to take root. My father stood in my doorway, his face red with anger and disappointment, and told me that if I couldn't appreciate the opportunities they were trying to provide, maybe I didn't deserve to be part of a family that valued education and success. My mother cried, but not for me, for the future she had imagined that was slipping away from her control. That night, I heard them talking in hushed voices about military school, about tough love, about the failure they believed I was destined to become. The morning they left, I had already been awake for hours, working on my computer while they moved around the house like ghosts preparing for their own funeral. I heard drawers opening and closing, suitcases being zipped, car doors slamming with finality that echoed through the walls of our home. They didn't say goodbye, didn't offer any explanation, didn't give me a chance to fight for my place in their lives one last time. The note was waiting for me on the kitchen counter when I emerged from my room, propped against a coffee mug like a casual reminder rather than a declaration of abandonment. You'll figure it out, as if figuring it out was something I hadn't already been doing while they were busy trying to figure me out. I read those words over and over until they lost all meaning, until they became just marks on paper instead of the end of everything I had known as family. The house settled into silence around me, a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive under the weight of their disappointment and my own uncertain future. But in that silence, I heard something they had never been able to hear, the sound of my own voice finally free to speak without interruption or criticism. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to discover during all those arguments and interventions and family meetings about my future, was that I had already started building something extraordinary. While they were sleeping, I was coding. While they were watching television, I was researching markets and analyzing consumer behavior patterns that would make their corporate jobs look like child's play. While they were worrying about my grades, I was developing a mobile application that solved a problem millions of people didn't even know they had yet. The late nights they attributed to video games and social media were actually spent learning programming languages, studying successful startups, and networking with other young entrepreneurs who understood that age was just a number when it came to changing the world. I had been accepted into an online accelerator program for teen entrepreneurs, something I never mentioned because I knew they would find a way to discourage me or turn it into another lecture about focusing on real school instead of fantasy projects. My laptop contained business plans that would age. Aave impressed investors twice my age, market analysis that showed genuine understanding of consumer psychology, and financial projections that demonstrated mathematical skills they claimed I didn't possess. The application I had been developing wasn't just some simple game or social media clone. It was a sophisticated platform that connected local service providers with customers in ways that existing apps hadn't figured out yet. I had identified gaps in the market that established companies were too big and bureaucratic to fill, opportunities that required the kind of agile thinking and risk-taking that only comes from having nothing to lose and everything to prove. The prototype was already functional, tested by a small group of beta users who provided feedback that helped me refine features and improve user experience with each iteration. I had been in contact with potential investors who saw promise in my work, mentors who believed in my vision, and fellow entrepreneurs who treated me as an equal rather than a child playing with grown-up toys. My bedroom wasn't just a teenager's sanctuary. It was a command center where I was orchestrating the launch of something that could generate more income in a year than my parents made in their combined corporate careers. They saw a messy room with clothes on the floor and empty pizza boxes on the desk, but they missed the multiple monitors displaying code that would soon power thousands of transactions. The whiteboards covered with strategic planning that would guide a company from startup to market domination. The most frustrating part wasn't their lack of understanding, it was their complete unwillingness to even try to understand what I was building right under their noses. Every time I attempted to share my progress or explain what I was working on, they would glaze over and redirect the conversation back to traditional measures of success like grades and college applications and summer jobs that would teach me the value of hard work. They couldn't see that I was already working harder than any summer job would ever require, putting in 18-hour days because I was passionate about what I was creating rather than grinding through tasks assigned by someone else. I was learning more about business, technology, and human behavior in my bedroom laboratory than I ever learned in any classroom, but they valued the piece of paper more than the practical knowledge I was accumulating. They wanted me to follow a path that millions of other people had already walked, while I was cutting through the forest to create a trail that others would eventually follow. The irony was that they thought they were protecting me from failure when they were actually trying to prevent me from succeeding beyond their wildest imagination. When the acceptance letter arrived from the accelerator program, I intercepted it before they could see it and add it to their growing list of distractions from real life. The program would provide mentorship, funding opportunities, and access to a network of successful entrepreneurs who could help me take my application from prototype to market leader. It was validation that my ideas had merit, that my work had value, that my vision was worth pursuing despite what my family believed about my capabilities and potential. I printed out the acceptance letter and kept it in my desk drawer like a secret weapon, proof that someone in the world recognized my worth even if the people who raised me couldn't see it. The program director had written a personal note praising my innovative approach to solving market problems and expressing excitement about working with someone so young who demonstrated such mature understanding of business principles. It was the kind of recognition I had craved from my parents but learned to stop expecting, the acknowledgement that I was capable of extraordinary things if given the opportunity to prove myself. As I stood in that empty apartment holding their farewell note, I realized that their leaving wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of the chapter one would write entirely on my own terms. The silence that had felt suffocating moments before now felt liberating, like the quiet before a storm that would reshape the landscape forever. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face as I reviewed the work that would soon change everything they thought they knew about success and failure. The application was ready for its next phase of development. The business plan was solid enough to attract serious investors, and I had accumulated enough knowledge and connections to launch something that would make headlines rather than just paychecks. They had given me the greatest gift they could have imagined without even knowing it, complete freedom to pursue my vision without their constant interference and discouragement. I opened a new document and began typing the email that would accept my place in the accelerator program, officially beginning the journey that would prove they had walked away from a son who was destined for greatness. 6 months later, I received an invitation that would change everything again. My uncle David, my father's brother who had always been the diplomatic bridge between family conflicts, was hosting his annual summer barbecue, the one gathering where the entire extended family comes together to catch up and show off their achievements from the past year. He had somehow gotten my EW address and sent me a handwritten invitation, complete with a note saying that family was family regardless of whatever differences had driven us apart. I stared at that invitation for hours, torn between the part of me that wanted to prove my worth to the people who had given up on me and the part that had learned to thrive without their approval or acknowledgement. The barbecue was still 2 weeks away, which meant I had time to decide whether facing them was worth the risk of reopening wounds that had finally started to heal. My application had launched successfully, user numbers were growing exponentially, and I had just signed my first major corporate partnership deal that would generate more revenue than I had ever imagined possible at 17 years old. The success felt complete without their validation, but something inside me wondered if seeing their faces when they learned the truth might provide a different kind of closure. I spent those 2 weeks debating whether to attend, weighing the satisfaction of vindication against the peace I had found in building my life without their influence or judgment. The boy they had abandoned would have desperately wanted their approval and recognition, but the young entrepreneur I had become wasn't sure their opinions mattered anymore. Still, there was something poetic about the timing. The way the invitation had arrived, just as my success was becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss as a lucky accident. I had proof now, concrete evidence that my dreams weren't fantasy but vision, that my work wasn't distraction but dedication, that my refusal to follow their path wasn't rebellion but wisdom. The application had been featured in technology magazines, praised by industry experts, and downloaded by users in 12 countries who found value in what I had created from nothing but determination and late nights in my bedroom. I had transformed from the family disappointment into something they couldn't understand or categorize, someone who had succeeded by breaking every rule they had tried to enforce. The decision to attend came not from a need for revenge or vindication, but from curiosity about who I had become in their absence, and whether facing them might help me understand how far I had traveled from the scared 17-year-old they had left behind. I RSVP'd yes to Uncle David, bought clothes appropriate for a family gathering where I would be representing myself rather than hiding from their expectations, and prepared to enter a world I had left behind when they walked out of mine. The young man who would walk into that barbecue bore little semblance to the teenager they remembered, not just in appearance, but in confidence, purpose, and the quiet certainty that comes from proving everyone wrong while maintaining your dignity and grace. The morning of the barbecue, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting a shirt that cost more than my family used to spend on groceries in a month. Funded not by credit cards or parental handouts, but by revenue from an application that was processing thousands of transactions every single day. The reflection looking back at me wasn't the angry, confused teenager they had abandoned, but someone who had learned to channel that abandonment into fuel for building something extraordinary from absolutely nothing. I had grown 3 inches taller, filled out from the scrawny kid who used to hide in his room, and developed the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can survive anything because you've already survived the worst thing imaginable. My hair was professionally cut, my clothes fit properly, and there was something in my eyes that hadn't been there before. A certainty that came from proving every doubt wrong through sheer determination and relentless work. The apartment I was leaving behind wasn't the cramped childhood bedroom where I had coded my first prototype, but a downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city I was slowly but surely conquering one user at a time. The walls were decorated not with participation trophies or Emily photos, but with framed articles from tech magazines that had featured my application, partnership agreements with major corporations, and a printed screenshot of my bank balance that still seemed surreal even though I checked it every morning. What they had never understood during all those It's about my future was that I wasn't just building an application, I was constructing an entire ecosystem that solved problems they didn't even know existed. The platform I had developed connected service providers with customers. But it did so using artificial intelligence algorithms that learned from every interaction and improved the matching process with mathematical precision that impressed even seasoned software engineers. While they were worried about my algebra grades, I was implementing machine learning models that could predict customer behavior patterns with accuracy rates that made established companies want to license my technology. The beta testing phase had revealed user engagement metrics that exceeded industry standards by margins that caught the attention of venture capital firms who specialized in identifying the next generation of unicorn startups. I wasn't just playing with code in my bedroom anymore. I was running a legitimate technology company that employed 6 full-time developers, 2 marketing specialists, and a customer service team that operated around the clock to support users across multiple time zones. The business had grown from a teenage fantasy into a real company with real employees earning real salaries for work that generated real value in the marketplace. The breakthrough moment had come 8 months after they left, when a major retail chain contacted me directly after discovering that their customers were using my application to find local services at unprecedented rates. The partnership negotiation process taught me more about business strategy and corporate relations than any classroom could have provided, but it also proved that my instincts about market needs were not only correct but ahead of the curve by several years. The contract I signed with them guaranteed minimum revenue streams that exceeded what most people earn in their entire careers, but more importantly, it validated that my vision had commercial viability on a scale that even I hadn't fully anticipated. The retail chain CEO, a woman who had built her own company from startup to Fortune 500 status, personally called to congratulate me and express her amazement that someone so young had developed such sophisticated understanding of consumer psychology and market dynamics. She became an unofficial mentor, introducing me to other industry leaders who saw potential in my work and wanted to explore collaboration opportunities that would expand my platform's reach into markets I had never considered. The media attention started small, with a local business journal writing a feature story about young entrepreneurs who were defying traditional expectations about age and success. The article included a photograph of me standing in my office space, surrounded by whiteboards covered with strategic planning and growth projections that looked more like abstract art than business documents. Within days, that story was picked up by regional publications, then national magazines, and eventually international technology blogs that specialized in covering emerging trends in the startup ecosystem. I gave interviews where journalists asked me about my background, my family, my education, and I learned to deflect questions about personal history while focusing on the technical innovations and business strategies that made my platform unique. The attention was overwhelming at first, but I quickly adapted to representing not just my own work, but the broader movement of young entrepreneurs who were proving that innovation doesn't require decades of experience, just vision, determination, and willingness to work harder than anyone expects. The Accelerator program had been transformative, connecting me with mentors who understood the challenges of scaling a technology startup from prototype to market dominance. My cohort included entrepreneurs from around the world, each working on different problems but sharing the common experience of building something from nothing while dealing with skepticism from people who couldn't see beyond traditional definitions of success. We met virtually twice a week, sharing progress updates, troubleshooting challenges, and celebrating victories that our families and friends often couldn't understand or appreciate. The program director, a former Google executive who had launched 3 successful startups before turning to mentorship, took particular interest in my work and introduced me to investors who specialized in funding companies led by unconventional founders. These weren't the kind of investors who required MBA degrees or corporate experience, but visionaries who recognized that the most disruptive innovations often came from people who approached problems without preconceived limitations about what was possible. The funding round that followed was both exhilarating and terrifying, involving presentations to venture capital firms that controlled budgets larger than the GDP of small countries. I walked into boardrooms filled with partners who had funded companies that everyone recognizes, carrying a laptop and a confidence that surprised even me as I explained my vision for transforming how people find and connect with local services. The questions they asked were sophisticated, probing. Not just the technical aspects of my platform, but my understanding of market forces, competitive landscapes, and scaling strategies that would determine whether my company would become a footnote or a phenomenon. I answered every question with data, projections, and strategic thinking that impressed investors who admitted they rarely saw such mature business understanding from founders twice my age. The term sheet I eventually signed provided enough funding to expand my team, accelerate development, and launch marketing campaigns that would introduce my platform to millions of potential users who didn't yet know they needed what I had built. Success at 18 felt different than I had expected, less like a destination and more like a launching pad for even bigger challenges and opportunities. The revenue numbers that appeared in my quarterly reports represented more than just financial achievement. They were proof that my refusal to follow conventional paths had been vindicated by marketplace acceptance and user adoption rates that exceeded every projection. My team had grown to include specialists in fields I was still learning about, people with graduate degrees and industry experience who treated me as their leader rather than questioning my qualifications or authority. The office space we occupied buzzed with the kind of creative energy that attracts top talent and generates breakthrough innovations on a regular basis. I was no longer working alone in my bedroom, but leading a company culture that valued innovation, collaboration, and the kind of bold thinking that established corporations often discourage in favor of incremental improvements and risk management. The personal transformation was as dramatic as the professional success, as I learned to navigate social situations where my age was less relevant than my accomplishments and strategic thinking. Business dinners with potential partners taught me confidence in environments where I was often the youngest person in the room, but rarely the least knowledgeable about market trends and consumer behavior. I developed relationships with other entrepreneurs who became genuine friends rather than just networking contacts, people who understood the isolation that comes with building something unprecedented while dealing with skepticism from those who prefer familiar patterns and predictable outcomes. The loneliness that had defined my teenage years was replaced by connections with people who shared my values, ambition, and willingness to work toward goals that others considered unrealistic or impossible. But despite all the external validation and financial success, there was still something unresolved about the family that had walked away from me before witnessing what I was capable of achieving. I found myself wondering if they followed technology news, if they had seen the articles about my company, if they ever regretted their decision to abandon me at the moment when I needed their support most. The part of me that had been wounded by their rejection wanted them to know what they had missed, wanted them to understand that their assessment of my potential had been catastrophically wrong, wanted them to see that the dreams they had dismissed as fantasy had become reality through work ethic and vision they had never bothered to recognize. The successful entrepreneur I had become didn't need their approval, but the abandoned 17-year-old inside me still craved acknowledgement that I had been worthy of their love and support all along. As I drove toward Uncle David's house for the barbecue, I reflected on how different this arrival would be from every other family gathering I had ever attended. Previously, I had slunk into these events expecting criticism, preparing for lectures about my grades or my attitude or my unrealistic expectations about my future. Today, I was arriving as someone who had achieved more in 18 months than most people accomplish in decades. Someone whose work was creating jobs and solving problems and generating revenue that allowed me to be financially independent before my 20th birthday. The car I was driving wasn't borrowed from parents or financed through student loans, but purchased with money I had earned through innovation and determination that no one in my family had ever taken seriously. The confidence I felt wasn't arrogance, but earned self-assurance that came from proving every doubt wrong while maintaining the integrity and work ethic that my parents had claimed I lacked. Uncle David's neighborhood looked exactly the same as I remembered, with well-maintained lawns and houses that reflected the comfortable middle-class lifestyle that my parents had always considered the pinnacle of success and security. I parked behind cars that I recognized from previous family gatherings, vehicles belonging to relatives who had watched my parents struggle with their problematic youngest child and probably agreed that tough love was the appropriate response to my supposed lack of direction and appreciation. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted from the backyard, the familiar soundtrack of family gatherings where everyone caught up on jobs and schools and achievements that fit neatly into categories my relatives could understand and celebrate. I sat in my car for a moment, listening to those voices and preparing myself for reactions that could range from surprise to skepticism to the kind of awkward discomfort that comes when people realize they have misjudged someone completely. Walking toward the backyard, I could see the same setup Uncle David used every year, with tables arranged around the pool, a grill smoking with whatever meat he had selected for this year's feast, and relatives clustered in small groups that would shift and reform throughout the afternoon as conversations evolved and alcohol loosened tongues that might otherwise remain diplomatic. I recognized my cousins immediately, though they had changed as much as I had during the time that had passed since our last awkward encounter. Emma was standing near the pool talking to our cousin Sarah, her artist hands gesturing as she described whatever project was currently consuming her creative energy. Marcus was by the grill with Uncle David and my father, looking exactly like the corporate success story he had always been destined to become, with clothes that suggested professional achievement and confidence that came from following a predetermined path to predictable results. The moment my parents noticed me approaching, the entire dynamic of the gathering shifted in ways that were immediately obvious to everyone present. My mother's face went through a series of expressions that started with surprise, moved through confusion, and settled on something that looked like fear mixed with hope and regret. My father stopped mid-sentence in whatever story he was telling, his eyes widening as he took in my appearance, and tried to reconcile the successful young man approaching with the disappointment he remembered abandoning over a year ago. The conversations around us gradually quieted as other relatives noticed the tension and began to understand that they were witnessing something significant, a reunion that carried emotional weight beyond the typical family gathering dynamics. Uncle David, ever the peacemaker, stepped forward with a smile that seemed genuine and relief that suggested he had been hoping for this moment since sending the invitation. But before anyone could speak, before the awkward reintroductions and careful conversations could begin, another car pulled into the driveway with timing that seemed orchestrated by forces beyond coincidence. The vehicle was a sleek black sedan with tinted windows and the kind of understated elegance that suggested its occupants were people of considerable importance and influence. I recognized the car immediately, though my family had no way of knowing that its arrival was connected to me or that the person stepping out of the passenger seat was about to transform this family gathering into something none of us would ever forget. Jennifer Walsh, the CEO of the retail chain had become my company's largest corporate partner, emerged from the sedan wearing the kind of business casual attire that managed to look both relaxed and authoritative. Perfect for someone who had built a billion-dollar company while maintaining the approachability that made her a beloved figure in the business community. She had texted me earlier in the week asking if we could meet to discuss expansion opportunities, and when I mentioned I would be attending a family gathering, she had surprised me by asking if she could join me for a few minutes to meet the people who had raised such an impressive young entrepreneur. I had warned her that my relationship with my family was complicated, but she had insisted that successful partnerships often required understanding the personal foundations that shaped the leaders she worked with. Her presence at this moment wasn't planned for dramatic effect, but her timing was perfect for providing the kind of external validation that would make denial or dismissal impossible, even for people who had convinced themselves that my success was somehow accidental or temporary. Jennifer approached our group with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms filled with executives who controlled budgets worth billions of dollars. Her smile was warm but professional as she extended her hand toward me, completely unaware that the simple gesture of greeting me as an equal was about to shatter every assumption my family had made about my capabilities and achievements. The silence that followed her arrival was deafening, with relatives frozen in various poses of confusion as they tried to understand why a woman who clearly represented serious business success was treating their supposed family failure with obvious respect and familiarity. My parents stood powerless, their faces cycling through expressions that revealed their struggle to process what they were witnessing, while my siblings exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to realize that something fundamental about their understanding of our family dynamics was about to change forever. "I hope I'm not interrupting your family time," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of making decisions that affect thousands of employees and millions of customers. But when someone builds a platform that revolutionizes how my company connects with local markets, I make time to meet the people who raised such an exceptional entrepreneur. The words hung in the air like smoke from Uncle David's grill, visible and impossible to ignore, while my family struggled to comprehend what they were hearing. My mother's mouth opened slightly as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't find words adequate for the situation unfolding before her. My father's face had gone pale, the corporate confidence he usually displayed at family gatherings replaced by the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Jennifer Walsh," she continued, introducing herself to the group with the same grace she displayed when addressing shareholders at annual meetings. "CEO of Meridian Retail Corporation. Your son's application has transformed how our customers find local services, generating revenue streams that exceeded our most optimistic projections." She turned toward me with genuine admiration that was impossible to fake or misinterpret. "The artificial intelligence algorithms he developed are so sophisticated that our technical team spent months trying to understand how someone so young could create something that solved problems our engineers had been struggling with for years." The validation in her voice was unmistakable, the kind of professional recognition that carries weight because it comes from someone whose success gives her opinions credibility that cannot be questioned or dismissed. Marcus was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "You're talking about our brother?" he asked, gesturing toward me as if confirming my identity for someone who might have confused me with a different person entirely. The disbelief in his question was understandable given that the last time he had seen me, I was the family disappointment who couldn't even maintain decent grades in high school. Jennifer's laugh was kind, but carried undertones of surprise that suggested she was beginning to understand the family dynamics that had shaped my journey toward independence and success. "Your brother has built one of the most innovative platforms in the service connection industry," she replied, her tone shifting slightly to include what sounded like gentle correction for his obvious shock. Emma stepped forward, her artist's intuition allowing her to read emotional undercurrents that others might miss. "We haven't seen him in over a year," she said quietly, her voice carrying guilt that hadn't been there during previous family gatherings when my absence was treated as relief rather than loss. "Our parents," she began, then stopped, clearly uncertain how much family history should be shared with someone who represented the business world that had embraced me while my own family had rejected me. Jennifer's expression shifted to something more serious as she began to understand that my success hadn't been achieved with family support but despite family opposition, a realization that seemed to increase her respect for what I had accomplished while dealing with personal challenges that would have destroyed less determined individuals. "Well," Jennifer said after a moment of silence that felt like hours, Talent like this doesn't go unnoticed in our industry. The partnership between our companies has been so successful that we're exploring expansion opportunities that could take his platform global within the next 18 months. She pulled out her phone and showed them the business application that bore my company's logo, an interface that millions of users access daily to find services they needed. His platform processed over 2 million transactions last quarter alone, connecting customers with local businesses in ways that benefit everyone involved. The numbers she cited weren't just impressive, they were game-changing, representing the kind of success that even corporate executives like my father would recognize as extraordinary achievement regardless of the age of the person who had created it. My father finally found his voice, though it shook with emotions he was clearly struggling to control. 2 million transactions, he repeated, as if saying the number aloud might help him process its significance. But he started, then stopped, apparently realizing that finishing the sentence would require acknowledging that his assessment of my potential had been completely wrong. The corporate executive who had lectured me about realistic expectations and practical career choices was being confronted with evidence that my unrealistic dreams had generated more business success than his decades of following conventional wisdom and safe choices. Jennifer nodded, her expression suggesting she was enjoying the opportunity to share details about a partnership that had exceeded her company's expectations. The revenue generated through our partnership last quarter alone was substantial enough to catch the attention of our board of directors, she continued. Clearly unaware that each detail she shared was devastating my parents' narrative about my lack of potential and direction. We're actually considering offering him a position on our Innovation Advisory Council, something we typically reserve for executives with decades of industry experience. The offer she was describing represented the kind of recognition that established professionals spend entire careers trying to achieve, validation from industry leaders who were acknowledging that my work had value beyond anything they had imagined possible when they walked away from me. My mother was crying now, tears that seemed to come from a deep well of regret and realization that she had abandoned a son who was destined for greatness. Uncle David, who had been watching this unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made in his own backyard, finally stepped forward to offer Jennifer something to drink and a chair by the pool. His hosting instincts kicked in, but there was also obvious pride in his voice as he introduced himself as my uncle and expressed his amazement at learning about accomplishments that no one in the family had known about. He always was different, Uncle David said, his words carrying weight because they came from someone who had tried to maintain family connections despite the conflicts that had torn us apart. Smart in ways that didn't always show up on report cards, but smart nonetheless. His support felt like validation from the one family member who had never completely written me off, even when my parents had made their decision to abandon me. Jennifer spent the next hour sharing details about our business relationship that painted a picture of professional success that my family had never imagined possible for someone they had dismissed as a failure. She described board meetings where my strategic insights had influenced corporate decis, ions affecting thousands of employees, innovation conferences where my presentations had impressed audiences filled with industry veterans, and partnership negotiations where my understanding of market dynamics had generated revenue streams that exceeded projections by significant margins. Each story she told was another piece of evidence that their assessment of my capabilities had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly incorrect. My siblings listened with expressions that cycled between amazement and guilt as they began to understand that the brother they had dismissed as the family disappointment had achieved more professional success than both of them combined. When Jennifer finally prepared to leave, she turned to my parents with an expression that managed to be both diplomatic and pointed. "You should be incredibly proud," she said, her words carrying implications that were impossible to miss. "What he's accomplished takes not just intelligence and technical skill, but the kind of determination and resilience that usually comes from overcoming significant challenges." The subtext was clear to everyone present. Successful people don't typically achieve what I had achieved without facing and conquering obstacles that would have defeated less persistent individuals. She shook my hand with obvious respect, mentioned that she looked forward to our meeting next week about the global expansion project, and walked back to her car, leaving behind a family gathering that had been transformed by her presence and revelations. The silence that followed her departure was unlike anything I had ever experienced at a family event, heavy with implications and emotions that no one seemed equipped to process or address directly. My parents stood together but somehow isolated, their faces showing the kind of shock that comes from discovering that everything you believed about reality was fundamentally incorrect. The son they had abandoned as a burden had become someone worthy of respect from leaders in industries they barely understood, generating success that made their own achievements look modest by comparison. Marcus and Emma moved closer to me, their body language suggesting they wanted to bridge gaps that had seemed unbridgeable just hours earlier. But their expressions revealed uncertainty about how to begin conversations that would require acknowledging years of dismissal and misunderstanding. My mother was the first to approach, her face streaked with tears that seemed to come from a reservoir of regret that had been building since the day they walked away from me. "We didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile opportunity for reconciliation might exist in this moment. "We thought." She began, then stopped, apparently realizing that explaining their thought process would require admitting that they had never bothered to truly understand who I was or what I was capable of achieving. Her hands reached toward me tentatively, seeking permission for physical contact with someone she had treated as unworthy of emotional investment. I let her embrace me, feeling her tears against my shoulder and understanding that this moment represented the beginning of a completely different relationship dynamic than anything we had ever experienced before. My father approached more slowly, his corporate bearing unable to completely mask the vulnerability of someone who was being forced to confront his own failures as a parent and judge of character. "I owe you an apology that's bigger than words can express," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that his mistakes had consequences that couldn't be easily repaired. "We were wrong about everything. About you, about your potential, about what success looks like." The admission came from someone who rarely acknowledged errors in judgment, particularly errors that revealed such fundamental misunderstanding of situations he had felt confident about. His handshake was firm but carried emotional undertones that suggested he was struggling with the realization that his son had achieved the kind of success he had always claimed to value while being rejected by the family that should have supported those achievements. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with a STR-ing mixture of celebration and processing as relatives who had witnessed the revelation struggled to adjust their understanding of family dynamics that had been completely rewritten in the space of an hour. Conversations that had started with typical family catching up evolved into discussions about my business, my plans for expansion, and my perspective on industries that most of them had never considered from an entrepreneurial viewpoint. Uncle David appointed himself as my unofficial publicity manager, introducing me to neighbors who stopped by and sharing details about my success with obvious pride that felt like compensation for the support I had never received from my immediate family. The dynamic had shifted so completely that I found myself in the unfamiliar position of being the family member whose achievements were being celebrated rather than questioned. Emma pulled me aside during a quiet moment by the pool, her artist sensitivity allowing her to navigate emotional complexity that others might avoid. "I'm sorry we didn't see you," she said, her words carrying layers of meaning that went beyond simple apology. "I'm sorry we didn't listen when you tried to show us what you were building." Her regret seemed genuine, coming from someone who understood creativity and innovation in her own field and should have recognized those qualities in her brother's work. We talked for nearly an hour about the isolation that comes with pursuing visions that others don't understand, the challenge of maintaining confidence when surrounded by skepticism, and the satisfaction that comes from proving doubters wrong through persistence and quality work rather than anger or revenge. Marcus approached our conversation with obvious hesitation, his corporate background making him more aware than our sister of the business implications of what Jennifer had revealed about my success. "The numbers she mentioned," he said, clearly still processing the scale of what I had achieved. "That's serious money, serious business impact." His acknowledgement carried weight because it came from someone whose career had taught him to recognize legitimate business success versus temporary luck or market anomalies. We discussed the technical aspects of my platform, the market forces that had made my approach successful, and the strategic thinking that had guided my decisions about partnerships and growth opportunities. For the first time in our relationship, he treated me as an equal rather than a younger brother who needed guidance and correction. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, I found myself experiencing something I had never felt at a family gathering: genuine acceptance and respect for who I had become rather than pressure to change into someone else's vision of who I should be. The conversations were different, the questions were about my work rather than my deficiencies, and the overall atmosphere reflected curiosity about my future plans rather than concern about my lack of direction. My parents remained somewhat subdued, clearly processing emotions and realizations that would take much longer than one afternoon to fully understand and integrate into their worldview. But their presence felt different, less judgmental and more genuinely interested in learning about the son they had clearly never understood despite raising him for 17 years. When it came time to leave, the goodbyes carried emotional weight that was entirely different from any previous family interaction I could remember. My mother hugged me with the kind of desperate affection that comes from someone who almost lost something precious through her own mistakes and poor judgment. My father shook my hand, but then pulled me into an embrace that felt like his attempt to bridge years of misunderstanding and rejection with a single gesture of acknowledgement and regret. Emma and Marcus both asked for my contact information, genuine interest in maintaining relationships that had been damaged by years of dismissal and misunderstanding, but could potentially be rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and recognition. Uncle David walked me to my car, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had always believed in my potential even when others couldn't see it. "I knew you were special," he said, his words carrying validation that felt particularly meaningful because it came from someone who had maintained faith when others had given up. "I'm proud of you for proving them wrong without losing your dignity in the process." His observation was accurate, despite having every justification for anger and resentment. I had maintained grace throughout the afternoon, allowing my success to speak for itself rather than using the opportunity for revenge or vindictive satisfaction. The validation felt complete not because my family finally understood my worth, but because I had proven it to myself while maintaining the integrity they had always claimed I lacked. As I drove away from Uncle David's house, I reflected on how different this departure felt from every other family gathering I had ever attended. Instead of leaving with frustration and disappointment, I was departing with a sense of closure and new beginnings that seemed to promise better relationships built on truth rather than misconceptions. The family that had abandoned me at 17 had discovered that their abandoned son had become someone worthy of respect and admiration from leaders in industries they barely understood. More importantly, I had learned that success achieved through integrity and hard work provides its own satisfaction regardless of whether anyone else recognizes or celebrates those achievements. The road ahead stretched out before me, illuminated by headlights that seemed to symbolize the clarity I had gained about my own worth and potential. My phone was already buzzing with text messages from family members who wanted to continue conversations that had been started at the barbecue, NCE that the relationships damaged by years of misunderstanding might be reparable if everyone involved was willing to invest the effort required for genuine reconciliation. But even if those relationships never fully healed, I had proven to myself that I could build a successful, meaningful life without the approval or support of people who had never understood my vision or potential. The boy they had abandoned had become a man they could finally respect, But more importantly, he had become someone who respected himself enough to maintain dignity even in moments of vindication and triumph.